Mafia boss catches Nanny dancing with son in wheelchair. What happened shocked everyone. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get started with today's story. It was a quiet afternoon at the grand mansion of the Romano family. The kind of place where power and wealth dripped from every chandelier, every polished surface, and every gleaming marble floor. The sprawling estate was a fortress of luxury, where every corner spoke of dominance and control. But today, something was happening that no one could have predicted, and certainly no one had planned for. Inside one of the mansion's vast, opulent rooms, a scene was unfolding that would change everything. Little Marco, the son of the notorious Mafia boss, Dante Romano, sat in his wheelchair, a boy of only 7, trapped in his own world of silence. His condition kept him confined to the chair, unable to move like other children his age. It had been years since his mother had passed, and Marco's health had only worsened in the time since. The nanny, Clara, had grown incredibly close to him over the years, like a second mother. Clara had been with the Romano family for nearly 5 years, and despite the cold and imposing atmosphere of the mansion, she was the one person who could make Marco smile. But today, things were different. Clara had noticed something in Marco's eyes earlier that morning, a flicker of emotion, a deep sadness that hadn't been there before. She couldn't ignore it. After all, she was the one who had seen him grow, and she felt a bond with him that surpassed the usual caretaker relationship. She gently placed him in the middle of the room, positioning his wheelchair in front of the grand piano. Music was the only thing that seemed to bring him peace. But Clara had something more in mind today, something that wasn't just about the piano. She reached for a nearby music box, one she had bought during a rare trip outside the estate. Its melody was soft and comforting, but she wasn't just going to play it. She had a plan. Clara began to hum a tune. It was an old lullaby her grandmother used to sing to her, a song of love, peace, and hope. At first, Marco didn't react, but as the melody filled the room, she began to sway gently. She held out her hand, as if inviting him to dance, but in his condition, that was impossible. However, Clara was determined. She stood up from her kneeling position and, with a soft smile, began to move around him, her feet slowly gliding across the floor. Clara knew the risks. She had been warned countless times not to let her emotions cloud her judgment, especially when it came to the boss's son. But today, she couldn't help it. The sight of Marco's eyes following her, the slightest smile beginning to form on his lips, it was a moment that felt more important than any rule. She danced slowly, as if the world outside that room had faded away. But what she didn't know was that someone had been watching. Dante Romano, the feared Mafia boss, had just returned to the mansion after a long meeting. He had expected to head straight to his office, away from the mansion's chaos. But as he passed the room where Clara and Marco were, something caught his attention. It was the music, the soft, tender notes that reached him long before he entered. He stood there for a moment, watching from the doorway, unable to make a sound. Clara was lost in the moment, her movements fluid and gentle, her face calm, but full of emotion. And then, his gaze moved to Marco, his son, the boy who never smiled, the boy who had been silent for far too long. Marco's face was softer now, his hands resting gently in his lap as he watched Clara. Dante's chest tightened as he watched the scene unfold. This was not the cold, distant nanny he had come to know. This was something else, something real, something human. But what happened next? Dante stepped into the room, his presence immediately shifting the atmosphere. Clara froze, startled, her heart skipping a beat as she turned to face him. The tension in the room was palpable. What would he say? What would he do? I was standing there, frozen. In place, my heart pounding in my chest. Dante Romano was in the room, staring at me, and for a moment, everything felt like it was happening in slow motion. His cold, calculating eyes were no longer just a distant presence in my life. Now, they were focused on me, on the woman who had just broken one of his most sacred rules. I had danced in front of his son, something I had never thought I would do in a million years. And now, I was left to face the consequences of that act. The consequences of doing something so utterly against the norm in a world that valued order above all else. But then, something unexpected happened. He didn't yell. He didn't storm across the room like I feared. Instead, his gaze softened, just a little. He took a step closer to me, his footsteps heavy on the marble floor. I could hear my breath, shallow and quick, as he moved toward me. For a moment, I thought he might demand an explanation, that he would remind me of my place in the mansion as a nanny, a servant, someone who was not supposed to have the luxury of emotions. But what came out of his mouth next surprised me even more. Why did you do it? Dante's voice was quiet, almost calm, though I could hear the edge of something else in his words, something that wasn't anger, but curiosity. I swallowed hard, trying to find my voice. The truth was, I didn't really know why I had done it. I had seen Marco's eyes, the way they seemed empty, distant, almost like he had given up. And I couldn't just stand there and let him slip away like that. I couldn't let him drown in his silence and isolation, not when I was the only one in his life who understood the weight of that kind of loneliness. He needed someone, I finally said, my voice barely above a whisper. He was hurting, and I just wanted to help him feel something again, even if it was just for a moment. Dante didn't respond immediately. He just stared at me, his intense gaze searching my face, looking for something I couldn't understand. The silence stretched between us like a heavy blanket. I could feel the tension in the room, the weight of the moment pressing down on me. It felt like everything I had done, every choice I had made in the past few years, was leading up to this one moment. Then, without warning, Dante stepped back, his expression unreadable. He looked over at Marco, who was still sitting in his wheelchair, his eyes wide and unblinking as he watched us. I had forgotten about him for a moment, lost in the tension with Dante. But now, I turned to look at him, my heart sinking as I saw the fragile boy, still caught in the web of his illness, his silence. You care for him, Dante said suddenly, his words breaking the quiet like a crack of thunder. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. I nodded slowly, not trusting myself to speak. I do, I said, my voice thick with emotion. He's like my own. Dante's eyes flicked back to me, and for a moment, I thought I saw something shift in them, something I hadn't expected. It was subtle, but it was there, a hint of respect, or maybe even understanding. He took a long breath, his jaw tightening. You're a good woman, he said, his voice low. But you've made things complicated now. I didn't know what to say to that. I didn't know how to respond to his sudden shift in tone, the way his presence seemed to soften, just slightly, around me. He turned his gaze back to Marco, who was still staring at us, his hands resting limply in his lap. For a moment, the silence in the room was absolute. I could feel the weight of Dante's presence behind me, like a force I couldn't escape. But then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the moment shifted again. Dante spoke, his words sharp and commanding. Get him out of that chair. His tone brooked no argument. I turned to look at him, confused, unsure if I had heard him right. What? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Dante was already stepping toward Marco, his movements precise, almost calculated. He walked over to the boy, bending down to his level, his face softening for the briefest moment as he gazed into Marco's eyes. You're not going to live your life in that chair forever, he said, his voice gentler now, though still firm. We're going to find a way for you to walk again. But it starts now. Get him out of that chair, Clara. I felt a surge of emotion flood my chest as I understood what he was saying. This wasn't just about Marco's physical condition. This was about his future. And Dante, for all his power and ruthlessness, was offering a chance. Not just for Marco, but for all of us, in that moment. I moved quickly, my hands trembling as I lifted Marco out of the chair, gently supporting his weight. He was light, fragile, but his eyes were filled with something I hadn't seen before, hope. It was just the beginning. But in that moment, it felt like the world had shifted. Dante turned to leave the room, his voice cutting through the air one last time. Take care of him, Clara. He's my son, and no one touches him without my say. As he walked out of the room, the weight of his words hung in the air like a promise. Marco's future, and mine, had just been changed forever. I stood there for a moment, still holding Marco in my arms, not fully understanding what had just transpired. Dante's words echoed in my mind, and as I looked down at Marco's wide eyes, I could see the smallest hint of something I hadn't seen before, hope. It was fragile, delicate, but it was there. For the first time in years, I felt like maybe we were headed in the right direction. As I gently set Marco back in his wheelchair, I noticed Dante standing by the doorway, watching me. His expression was unreadable, but his presence was undeniable. The air was thick with tension, but there was something else now, something different. I could feel it, the shift in the dynamic between us. "We'll start therapy tomorrow," Dante said, his voice quiet, but firm. "I want him walking again, Clara. I don't care how long it takes." His gaze was intense, the weight of his words settling on me. I nodded, my mind racing. Therapy? For Marco? Could it be possible? But then I saw it in Dante's eyes, the same determination I had seen in the way he ran his empire, the way he controlled everything around him. And in that moment, I realized that Marco's future had just changed. My future had just changed. "You'll be here for him," Dante added, his voice softer now, almost like a command, wrapped in concern. "We'll get through this together." I could feel a lump form in my throat as his words settled into my chest. I didn't know what he saw in me, or why he trusted me so much. But I knew one thing for certain. Marco was my responsibility now, and I wouldn't let him down. Not after everything. "I will," I said, my voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions inside me. Dante didn't say anything else. He simply turned and walked out of the room, leaving me alone with Marco. The silence that followed felt heavier than ever. But there was something different now, something in the air that made it seem like the weight of the world wasn't quite so crushing. Marco looked up at me, his little face full of confusion, but there was a spark of something else there, something I hadn't seen before. Trust. He was starting to trust me. I smiled softly at him, brushing a strand of hair away from his face. "It's going to be okay, Marco," I whispered. "We're going to get through this." Over the next few days, things began to shift. Dante kept his word. He brought in the best specialists, the best doctors, and Marco's therapy began almost immediately. At first, Marco struggled. The exercises were difficult, and he wasn't used to moving in ways that his body didn't allow. But he kept trying. And so did I. There were days when I felt like I was pushing him too hard, but every time I looked at his face, I saw that glimmer of hope. It was all we had, but it was enough. Dante was always there, too, standing in the background, watching, waiting. He didn't intervene often, but I could feel his presence, his unwavering determination, and it pushed me to work harder, to do more for Marco. I could see the way Dante looked at Marco now, different from before. It was like he was seeing his son for the first time, really seeing him. Every time Marco made progress, no matter how small, Dante was there, his approval visible in his eyes, though he never spoke the words. It was strange. It was like we were becoming a family. But I didn't want to get ahead of myself. Dante was still the Mafia boss, and I was still just the nanny. There were lines I couldn't cross, no matter how much things were changing. One evening, after a particularly difficult therapy session, I was sitting with Marco in his room, reading him a book. It was a quiet moment, just the two of us, when Dante came in. He didn't say anything at first, just stood by the door, watching us. "How's he doing?" he asked, his voice low. "He's tired," I said, looking up at him. "But he's improving." Slowly. Dante nodded, his gaze flicking to Marco, who was now resting in his chair, his eyes half closed. "Good," he said. Then, his voice softened, just a little. "You're doing good work, Clara." "Thank you." The words caught me off guard. Dante was not a man who gave compliments easily. In fact, he rarely gave them at all. But there was something in his tone, something in the way he said it, that made me realize how much I had come to mean to him. How much Marco had come to mean to him. The room was silent for a long moment, and I could feel my heart racing. Dante finally turned to leave, but before he did, he looked back at me, his expression hardening again. "Don't let him down," he said, his voice steady. "I won't," I promised, though I wasn't sure if I was promising him or myself. After he left, I sat in the room with Marco for a little while longer, my thoughts swirling. Things had changed. They were changing. And no matter what happened, I knew I had a responsibility now. A responsibility to Marco, to Dante, and to myself. The path ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, I truly believed we could make it. Marco and I could make it. I had been so focused on Marco's progress, on the little victories that felt like monumental achievements, that I hadn't noticed how much things were shifting around me. The mansion had always been a place of cold power, where everything seemed calculated, where nothing was ever out of place. But now, it felt different. The walls that had once seemed so impenetrable were beginning to crack, and I wasn't sure if I was ready for what that meant. Dante was always there, watching, observing. But the way he looked at me now, the subtle changes in the way he spoke to me, it made my heart race in ways I didn't expect. I couldn't afford to get too comfortable, though. This was still the Mafia world, and in this world, emotions were dangerous. But as each day passed, it became harder to ignore the growing bond between us. Dante's protective nature toward Marco had only deepened, and I could see how much he cared for his son. It wasn't just about being the Mafia boss anymore. It was about being a father. And I had a feeling that the more Marco improved, the more Dante would soften, though I wasn't sure if that was something I should hope for. As the days turned into weeks, Marco's therapy progressed. Slowly but surely, he started showing signs of improvement. It wasn't easy, and there were setbacks, but I could see the light in his eyes growing stronger with each small success. He was starting to believe that he could walk again, and that was all I needed to see. Dante had been keeping a close eye on everything, and I had learned not to miss the subtle looks he gave me when he thought I wasn't paying attention. One evening, after another grueling therapy session, I was sitting with Marco in the garden, watching the sunset. The air was cool, and the garden, though meticulously maintained, felt like a place of refuge. It was the first time in a long time that I felt a sense of peace. Marco had just finished one of his exercises and was taking a break. He was sitting next to me, his little legs stretched out in front of him, looking up at the sky. "Clara, will I ever be able to walk like the other kids?" Marco asked, his voice soft, tinged with uncertainty. His question hit me harder than I expected. I could feel the weight of his words, the vulnerability in them. I had spent so much time trying to be strong for him that I hadn't realized how much he was carrying. "You will, Marco," I said, my voice steady, though my heart was racing. "You just have to keep trying. And we will be here with you every step of the way." Marco smiled at me, but it was a small smile, one that still carried the weight of all his doubts. I reached out and gently ruffled his hair, trying to give him the reassurance I knew he needed. But just as the moment seemed to settle, I heard footsteps approaching. I turned to see Dante walking toward us, his presence as imposing as always, yet there was something different in his step tonight. There was a softness, a quiet pride that seemed to radiate from him as he approached us. "How's he doing?" Dante asked, his voice low, but warm. I looked at Marco, who was now staring at Dante with a mixture of admiration and a bit of hesitation. "He's doing well," I replied, my voice calm. "Better than I thought he would at this point." Dante nodded, his eyes moving from Marco to me. I could see the shift in his gaze, the unspoken gratitude that passed between us. "You've done well, Clara," he said, his tone almost surprising me with its sincerity. It wasn't often that Dante complimented anyone, let alone me. I wasn't sure how to respond, so I simply nodded, unsure if I should allow myself to feel anything more than gratitude in that moment. But before I could say anything else, Dante crouched down beside Marco, his expression softening as he looked at his son. Marco looked up at him, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he didn't flinch. Instead, he smiled, and the warmth that spread across Dante's face was unmistakable. "You're doing great, Marco," Dante said, his voice full of pride. "Keep going. We'll get you there." Marco's eyes lit up, and I could see the relief wash over him. He had always been so afraid that his condition would define him, that it would keep him from ever achieving anything in life. But now, I could see the belief returning to him. I couldn't help but smile as I watched the two of them together. It was a side of Dante I hadn't seen before, one that showed the depth of his love for his son. But just as quickly as the moment came, it was gone. Dante stood up, his expression returning to its usual stoic mask. He glanced at me, then back at Marco. "You're making progress. Keep it up." His words were brief, but there was something about the way he said them that made me believe in the possibilities ahead. I didn't know what the future held, or how long it would take for Marco to fully recover. But one thing was certain, Dante was committed to his son's well-being, and so was I. And that was a bond one never expected to form. But now that it was here, I wasn't sure how to break free of it. As Dante turned to leave, I stayed with Marco for a while longer. The evening sky was slowly fading into night, but the warmth of the moment lingered in my chest. Maybe there was more hope for us than I had realized. And maybe, just maybe, the family I had always dreamed of was starting to take shape. I woke up early the next morning, the sound of the estate's quiet echoing through the massive halls. It felt strange to be in the mansion, knowing how much had changed in just a few short weeks. Marco was making progress, but there was still so much work to be done. I couldn't afford to let my guard down, not in this world where emotions were a weakness. And yet, with each passing day, it was getting harder to ignore the connection growing between me and Dante. I had never thought I would find myself in this position. A simple nanny who, by some twist of fate, had become an essential part of the Romano family. A family I had never imagined myself being a part of. The connection I felt with Marco was undeniable. He had become my responsibility, my mission. But the way Dante looked at me, it was different now. His eyes lingered a little longer, his words softer. He was changing, and so was I. And I wasn't sure where this was headed. But I had to focus. I had to keep my eye on Marco's recovery, and nothing else. I walked down the long corridor, past the lavish rooms and intricate paintings, to Marco's therapy room. The sun was just beginning to rise, and the first rays of light filtered through the tall windows, casting long shadows on the marble floor. Marco was already there, sitting in his wheelchair, staring out the window. He had been up for a while. I could tell by the way he looked lost in thought. I walked over to him, my footsteps soft, and placed a hand on his shoulder. He turned to look at me, a faint smile forming on his lips. "Good morning, Clara," he said, his voice quiet, but stronger than I had ever heard it before. His words brought a rush of warmth to my chest. The old Marco, the one who had been so withdrawn, so distant, seemed to be disappearing, replaced by a boy full of potential, full of hope. "Good morning, Marco," I replied, sitting down beside him. "Ready for today's session?" He nodded, his eyes bright. "Yeah, I think so." I smiled, though I could feel the weight of the responsibility on my shoulders. But today felt different. Today felt like another step forward. We spent the next hour working on his exercises. The progress was slow, but it was progress, and that was all that mattered. Every small achievement, every time Marco managed to move just a little bit further, it felt like a victory. And as much as I wanted to celebrate those victories, I knew better than to let my emotions get the best of me. But Dante was always there, watching, silent, his gaze focused on Marco's every move. It was hard to ignore his presence. He was always just around the corner, his eyes never far from his son. And every time Marco succeeded, I could feel Dante's pride, even if he never voiced it. But that wasn't enough for me. I had come to care deeply for Marco, and in my quiet moments, I couldn't help but wonder what would happen to him when I wasn't around. What would happen to me, for that matter? But those were thoughts I couldn't afford to entertain. Marco was making strides, and that was all that mattered. But then, a knock at the door interrupted my thoughts. It was Dante. He stepped inside, his usual air of authority surrounding him, but there was something else in his eyes. Something different. "How's he doing?" Dante asked, his voice low but gentle. "Better," I said, standing up to face him. "He's improving." Dante nodded, his eyes briefly flicking to Marco, who was now concentrating on his next movement. "Good. Keep it up, Clara," he said, his tone firm, but the slight softness in his voice didn't go unnoticed. There it was again, the subtle shift. I could feel it between us. "I will," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "We're getting there." Dante didn't say anything else. He just watched for a moment longer, before turning to leave. But before he reached the door, he paused, and I saw him hesitate. It was brief, barely noticeable, but it was there. "Clara," he said, his voice quiet. I turned to face him. "Thank you. For everything." His words hung in the air for a moment, and then he was gone. I stood there, staring at the door, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But there was no time to dwell on it. I had to focus on Marco. I had to focus on him getting better. As the day wore on, I kept my attention on Marco's progress, guiding him through each step, each challenge. But every time I looked up, I couldn't help but see Dante's presence, lingering in the background, watching. It was as though he was always there, always a part of this journey, whether he spoke or not. And despite everything, despite the chaos of the world we lived in, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were becoming something more than just an employer and employee. The connection between me, Marco, and Dante was undeniable, and I wasn't sure how to handle it. But for now, All I could do was continue to be there for Marco. For him, I would do whatever it took. And that was the promise I made to myself as I watched him make yet another small step forward. I had never imagined that my life would take such a turn. A few weeks ago, I was just a nanny, working long hours to care for Marco. Now, I was deeply embedded in the Romano family's world, and every day seemed to blur the line between responsibility and something more complicated. Dante's presence in the mansion was constant, his eyes always on Marco, always observing me. He wasn't as distant as he used to be. There was something about the way he watched us that made me feel both uneasy and strangely protective of him. His son's progress was slow, but it was real. Marco was getting stronger with each passing day, and the small victories we celebrated felt like everything. But something else was growing between me and Dante. It wasn't just about Marco anymore. It was about us. It was about the way he would look at me when he thought I wasn't paying attention. The way his gaze softened when he saw Marco smiling or making progress. It was a look I didn't know how to handle. I tried to focus on Marco's recovery. That was the most important thing. But in the quiet moments, when Marco would rest after therapy, I couldn't help but notice how much closer Dante was getting. It wasn't just his proximity that was changing. It was the way he was speaking to me now, less like an employer, more like something else. And it confused me. I had never thought of Dante as anything more than the cold, calculating Mafia boss. But now he was different. One evening, after another round of therapy, Dante approached me in the garden. Marco had just finished his session and was resting in his wheelchair, staring out at the garden's vast expanse. I was sitting beside him, trying to keep my thoughts focused on the task ahead. I couldn't afford to let myself get distracted. "Clara," Dante said, his voice breaking the quiet. I looked up, startled. He was standing just a few feet away, watching me with an unreadable expression. "How is he doing?" he asked, his voice calm but firm, as if nothing had changed. "Better," I replied, forcing myself to remain composed. "He's making progress." Dante nodded, but his eyes lingered on me for a moment longer than usual. There was something in his gaze that made my heart race. "You've done well," he said quietly. I didn't know how to respond. It was the first time he had acknowledged my role in Marco's progress so directly, and it left me speechless. I had always known my place in this house. I was the nanny. I wasn't supposed to be seen, let alone acknowledged for my efforts. But Dante's words lingered, hanging in the air between us like an unspoken invitation. I didn't dare to think about what it might mean. "Thank you," I said, my voice barely a whisper. I couldn't think of anything else to say. "I just want to help him," I added, as if that somehow explained everything. Dante stepped closer, his shadow falling over me. For a moment, he seemed to consider something. His gaze softened, and for the first time, I saw the man behind the Mafia boss. He wasn't just a cold, ruthless leader of men. He was a father, a grieving man who wanted nothing more than to see his son walk again. "He's lucky to have you," Dante said, his words almost too soft to hear. "We're all lucky," I replied before I could stop myself. Dante didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked at Marco, who was now watching us with wide, curious eyes. I could tell he was still unsure of everything. Unsure of the therapy, unsure of the changes happening in his life. But there was something in the way Dante looked at him that made me believe, for the first time, that Marco had a real chance. A chance to be a kid again. A chance to live. Dante turned his gaze back to me, and I saw something flicker in his eyes. Something deeper, something more than just gratitude. It was a moment that could have meant everything, but before I could process it, he stepped back. "I'll be in the study if you need me," he said, his tone returning to its usual controlled state. I nodded, not trusting myself to say anything else. As Dante walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. I couldn't tell if it was just me or if Dante felt it too. But as I sat there with Marco, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I realized that the path ahead was not as simple as it seemed. There were layers to this, layers that went beyond the boundaries I had set for myself. And whether I was ready for it or not, the journey we were on was about to take a new turn. The days continued to pass, with Marco growing stronger each day, his small victories adding up. He was learning to trust himself, to believe that he could do more than he had ever imagined. And I was learning to trust in something else, something that I wasn't sure how to define. Dante's presence was becoming harder to ignore. It wasn't just the way he watched us, It was the way he spoke to me now, the way his eyes seemed to linger when he spoke. I wasn't sure what he wanted from me, and I wasn't sure I was ready to ask. But one thing was certain. Marco's recovery was becoming more than just a goal. It was becoming the foundation for something that none of us could have anticipated. I had spent so many days focusing on Marco's progress that I hadn't truly taken the time to reflect on the bigger picture. Dante's presence had become a constant, but now it felt like something else, something that reached deeper than just his role as the Mafia boss. He had always been distant, closed off in his own world. But now, the way he interacted with me, his softer words, his lingering glances, it all felt like a shift I wasn't prepared for. But I couldn't afford to let myself get distracted. Marco needed me. His recovery was slow, but each day brought him closer to the future I knew he deserved. And that future was all that mattered. The therapy sessions had become a routine now, each exercise more challenging than the last. Marco was stronger, his body beginning to respond more than it ever had before. His movements, though still tentative, were becoming more controlled, more confident. I saw the change in him, and I couldn't help but feel proud. Proud of him, proud of how far we had come together. But even as Marco made progress, the tension between me and Dante remained. It wasn't that we hadn't spoken, it was the opposite. We were speaking more, but the words were weighted, the silences between us growing longer, filled with unspoken things. One afternoon, after a particularly difficult therapy session, Marco and I took a break in the garden. The air was still warm, the sun low in the sky, casting long shadows across the neatly manicured lawn. Marco was sitting beside me, his small hand in mine as we watched the sunset together. For a brief moment, everything felt perfect. "Clara," Marco said quietly, breaking the silence. "Do you think I'll ever walk again?" His question hit me harder than I expected. The doubt in his voice was so raw, so real. It made my heart ache. I squeezed his hand gently. "Yes," I said, my voice steady despite the knot in my chest. "I believe you will. You just have to keep going, keep fighting. We'll do it together." Marco looked up at me, his eyes filled with the hope I had come to cherish. His small smile made everything worth it. But just as the moment settled, I heard footsteps approaching. I turned to see Dante walking toward us. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes that I couldn't quite place. He stopped a few feet away from us, watching Marco with a quiet intensity. For a moment, it felt like the world had narrowed to just the three of us. "How's he doing?" Dante's voice was low, but there was a trace of something softer in it than usual. "Better," I replied, not knowing what else to say. "He's improving every day." Dante nodded, but his gaze never left Marco. "Good," he said, his voice filled with an emotion I couldn't quite define. There was a long pause before he spoke again. "You've done well, Clara." The words took me by surprise. Dante didn't often offer praise, especially not to someone like me. But hearing it now, in the quiet of the garden, it meant more than I could express. "Thank you," I replied, my voice quiet. Dante glanced at me for a moment, his eyes lingering on mine before turning back to Marco. "You've really helped him," Dante said, almost to himself. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away, his steps steady and purposeful. I stayed there, staring after him, my thoughts racing. It was the first time Dante had acknowledged my role in all of this in such a direct way. I had always known that I was just the nanny, but now, it felt like something more. Marco's progress was undeniable. The boy I had cared for so long was finally starting to trust again. The therapy was working, but it wasn't just the exercises that were helping him. It was the love, the care, and the attention he was receiving that was making the real difference. But what about Dante? What about me? I couldn't ignore the tension that lingered between us, the silent understanding that seemed to grow each day. I had become an integral part of this family, whether I was ready for it or not. But what did that mean? Was I just here to help Marco, or was there something more at play? I had no answers, not yet. But one thing was clear. Dante's eyes weren't just watching Marco anymore. They were watching me too. I couldn't deny the pull between us, the connection that was slowly but surely forming. It was dangerous, I knew that. I had no place in his world, and yet, it was becoming impossible to ignore the way things were changing. Dante's unspoken respect, his subtle gestures of kindness, the way he seemed to trust me more. Each day, it was all too much to ignore. But for Marco's sake, I couldn't afford to focus on anything but his recovery. I had made a promise to myself and to him. He needed me. And so did Dante, whether I was ready to admit it or not. As the sun set on that quiet evening, I couldn't help but feel like something was about to change. What, exactly, I wasn't sure. But I had a feeling that whatever came next, it was going to change all of our lives forever. I had been working with Marco for hours, guiding him through each of the exercises that had become our routine. His progress was slow, but it was progress. Every small victory, every time he managed to do something he hadn't been able to do the day before, felt like a personal triumph. And yet, as much as I focused on Marco, I couldn't help but notice how the air between Dante and me was growing more charged. We were no longer just two people in the same house. There was something unspoken between us, a tension that neither of us was willing to address. Dante had always been a man of control, of power, but now there was a shift. His presence in the house wasn't just the cold, authoritative figure it had once been. There was warmth in the way he interacted with Marco, in the way he looked at me when he thought I wasn't paying attention. I didn't know how to handle it. My focus was on Marco, and that had to be enough. But when Dante was around, when he spoke to me with that softness in his voice, I couldn't help but feel the weight of his attention. It made me feel seen in a way I had never expected. That night, after Marco had gone to sleep, I found myself alone in the garden again. It had become a quiet retreat for me, a place where I could think without distraction. The stars were barely visible in the sky, the city lights blocking them out, but I didn't mind. The cool air on my skin was enough to clear my head. I hadn't expected Dante to find me out there, but of course, he did. I heard his footsteps before I saw him, the sound of his shoes against the gravel a quiet announcement of his arrival. "Clara," he said, his voice calm but firm, like he always did when he wanted to draw my attention. I turned to face him, my heart beating a little faster than I wanted to admit. "I didn't expect you to be out here alone." Dante's gaze held mine for a long moment before he continued. "I thought you'd be with Marco." "I was," I replied, my voice steady, though the words felt like they were slipping from my lips without my permission. "He's resting now." Dante nodded, stepping closer, his presence filling the space between us. "How's he doing?" His question wasn't just about the physical therapy. I knew that. It was about everything. The way Marco had started to trust me, the way he was beginning to trust the world again. "Better," I said, keeping my voice even. "He's making progress." There was a long pause, one that felt heavier with each second. Dante was standing just a few feet away from me now, his eyes intense, but there was something else in them. Something softer, more vulnerable than I had ever seen before. It was as if he was trying to find something, trying to understand something that was just out of reach. "You've done more for him than anyone else could," Dante said, his voice low and filled with an emotion I couldn't place. "And more than I ever expected." My chest tightened at his words. "I'm just doing my job," I said, though it felt like a lie the moment the words left my mouth. I wasn't just doing my job. I was giving everything I had for Marco. And in the process, I was losing myself in the process. Dante didn't say anything to that. Instead, he stepped closer, his gaze never leaving mine. "It's more than that, Clara," he said, his voice softer now, almost a whisper. "You've become part of this family, and you're more important to us than you know." His words hit me harder than I expected. The way he said it, so matter of fact, but also with such sincerity, made something inside me stir. I had never imagined I would be a part of the Romano family, not in this way. I had always kept my distance, always kept myself hidden behind the role of the nanny. But now, with Dante standing there, looking at me like this, I wasn't sure where the line was anymore. "Dante," I began, but I didn't know what to say next. There were so many things I wanted to say, so many things I didn't understand, but all I could do was look at him. His presence was overwhelming, his attention focused on me in a way that made everything feel too real. He reached out then, his hand brushing lightly against mine. It was a small gesture, but it sent a shiver through me. "You've changed things for him," he said softly, his eyes never leaving mine. And for me, I couldn't speak. The words were stuck in my throat. All I could do was stand there, feeling the weight of his words, feeling the weight of everything between us. And then, as quickly as it had come, the moment passed. Dante stepped back, his expression returning to its usual cool detachment. "I'll leave you to your thoughts," he said, his voice low. But just remember, Clara, you've become more than just a part of Marco's life. You're a part of mine now, too. I stood there, frozen, as Dante turned and walked away. His words echoed in my mind long after he had gone, leaving me standing alone in the garden, unsure of what had just happened, unsure of what it meant. The quiet of the night wrapped around me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that everything had just shifted, that something was about to change between us. And for the first time, I wasn't sure if I was ready for it. I stood there for a long time after Dante left, the weight of his words sinking in. It was impossible to ignore how things were shifting, how everything was changing between us. I had tried so hard to keep my distance, to remain focused on Marco and nothing else. But Dante's presence had become impossible to avoid. The subtle way he watched me, the moments of kindness he had shown, it was all starting to blur the lines between what was right and what I was feeling. I couldn't deny that I had started to care about him, and as much as I tried to push it down, I knew it was becoming more difficult to ignore. But I couldn't let myself focus on that. Not yet. Marco needed me, and I had promised myself that I wouldn't lose sight of that. He had made so much progress, and I wasn't going to let anything derail his recovery. The next morning, I was back in Marco's therapy room, watching as he struggled with his latest set of exercises. He was trying so hard, his small body shaking with effort, but I could see the determination in his eyes. Every time he moved, every time he managed to push through the pain, it felt like a victory. "You're doing great," I said, encouraging him, my voice calm and steady. Marco smiled weakly, his face flushed from the exertion, but I could see the pride in his eyes. He had come so far. Just a few weeks ago, he could barely move, and now, here he was, working harder than anyone I had ever known. As he took a break, I sat next to him, my heart swelling with pride. "Clara, do you think I'll really be able to walk again?" Marco asked quietly, his voice full of doubt. I turned to him, my heart aching at the question. "Yes," I said firmly. "I know you will. You just have to keep believing." I could see that he wasn't entirely convinced, but I wasn't going to let him give up. Not when he had come so far. As I sat with Marco, I couldn't help but think about Dante. He had been so distant at first, but now, he was different. He was showing up more, watching Marco's progress, and there was a softness in his eyes when he looked at me. It was becoming impossible to ignore the connection between us. It wasn't just about the therapy anymore. It was about us. His approval, the way he looked at me, the way he said things that made me feel like I was becoming something more than just a caretaker. It made my head spin, but I couldn't let myself get distracted. I had a responsibility to Marco, and that was all I could focus on. Later that day, after Marco had finished his session, I found myself alone in the garden again. The sun was starting to set, and the air had grown cooler. I was lost in thought when I heard footsteps approaching. I didn't need to look to know it was Dante. His presence was unmistakable, and it always seemed to make everything feel more intense. He stopped a few feet away from me, his eyes on Marco, who was resting nearby. "He's doing well," Dante said, his voice quieter than usual. "You've really helped him." I glanced at him, surprised by the sincerity in his tone. "I'm just doing my job," I replied, my voice steady, but I couldn't ignore the way his words made me feel. "You've done more than that," Dante said, his eyes softening as he looked at me. There was something in his gaze that made my heart skip a beat. "I'm proud of what you've done for Marco. And for me." The last part caught me off guard. For a moment, I couldn't speak. His words were unexpected, and they stirred something deep inside me. Dante was a man who never spoke openly about his feelings, especially not to someone like me. And yet, here he was, telling me how much my presence in his life had meant. "Thank you," I said quietly, unsure of what else to say. It's just what I do." Dante nodded, but his gaze lingered on me for a moment longer. "You're more than that, Clara," he said, his voice soft but intense. I felt a lump form in my throat as I realized what he was saying. He wasn't just talking about my role in Marco's life. He was talking about me. He was talking about something more than just my job. "Dante," I began, but my words faltered. I didn't know what to say. I had never imagined that I would be in this position, that I would become so entwined in this family. It was dangerous, I knew that. The Mafia world was never kind to those who got too close. But despite that, I couldn't ignore the way Dante made me feel. "I can't stay in the background forever," I said, my voice barely a whisper. Dante's eyes flicked to mine, and for a moment, I thought he might say something to dismiss me, to remind me of my place. But instead, he stepped closer, closing the space between us. "You don't have to," he said quietly. "You've already made your mark on this family, Clara." I didn't know what to say to that. My heart was racing, but I wasn't sure if it was from fear or something else. I had no place in his world, and yet, it felt like I was being pulled deeper into it with each passing day. Dante's presence in my life was becoming impossible to ignore. "I don't know where this is going," I said, my voice trembling slightly. Dante's gaze softened, and for the first time, I saw something in his eyes that wasn't just about power. It was about something real. "Neither do I," he said quietly, his voice low. "But we'll figure it out together." And for the first time, I didn't feel afraid of the unknown. I didn't feel afraid of what might come next. I just felt a strange sense of peace, as though we were moving forward together, even if neither of us knew what that would look like. I woke up that morning feeling different. It was as if the air in the mansion had shifted overnight, carrying with it the weight of unspoken words and promises I wasn't ready to face. Dante's words from last night echoed in my mind. "We'll figure it out together." But what did that really mean? Was it just a passing sentiment, or was he truly opening up to something more? And what about me? I had never expected to find myself in a situation like this. I had come to this mansion as a nanny, to take care of Marco, and now I was tied to this family in ways I didn't understand. I had made a promise to Marco, to be there for him, to help him heal. That promise had become my anchor, keeping me grounded in a world that seemed to be spinning faster than I could catch up. Marco's therapy had been going well. He was getting stronger, more confident, and his smile had started to appear more often. But there were moments when his doubts crept back in, and I knew it was my job to help him through them. It was a heavy responsibility, but one I had come to embrace. As I made my way to the therapy room, I couldn't help but notice the silence in the house. The kind of silence that filled every corner, every hallway. It was the kind of silence that came before something big, something life-changing. I wasn't sure what it was, but I felt it in my bones. When I entered Marco's room, he was already there, sitting in his wheelchair, his eyes focused on the floor. He was deep in thought, as he often was. But today there was something different. There was a determination in the way he sat, a quiet resolve that I hadn't seen before. "Hey, Marco," I said softly, walking over to him. He looked up, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Hi, Clara," he said, his voice steady. I could tell he was trying his best to stay positive, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes that I couldn't ignore. "Ready for today's session?" I asked, trying to keep things light. Marco nodded. "Yeah, I think I can do it today." There was a confidence in his words that made my heart swell with pride. We spent the next hour working on his exercises, each movement more precise than the last. Marco's strength was growing, and I could see the way his body was beginning to adapt. It wasn't easy, but it was progress, and that was enough for me. After the session, we sat together in silence for a while. Marco was resting, his eyes closed as he took a moment to catch his breath. I could feel the weight of the day settling over me, the exhaustion from all the work we had done. But there was something else too, something that I couldn't quite put my finger on. As I sat there, lost in thought, the door opened. It was Dante. He stepped into the room without a word, his presence filling the space like it always did. He glanced at Marco, then at me. There was something different about him today, something I couldn't name. "How's he doing?" Dante asked, his voice calm, but there was a hint of concern in it that I hadn't heard before. "He's doing well," I said, looking at Marco. "Better than I expected, actually." Dante nodded, his gaze lingering on Marco for a moment longer before it shifted to me. "You've been a good influence on him," he said, his voice softer than usual. I wasn't sure how to respond to that. The way he said it, the sincerity behind his words, it felt like more than just a passing compliment. "He's doing all the hard work," I said quietly. "I'm just helping him along the way." Dante's eyes softened, and for a moment, I saw something in them that I couldn't place. It was the same look he had given me the night before, the one that made my heart skip a beat. "You've done more than that," he said, stepping a little closer. "You've made him believe again. And that's something I can never repay." My chest tightened at his words. I had never expected Dante to speak to me like this, to show me this kind of vulnerability. It was unsettling, yet somehow comforting. "I'm just doing what needs to be done," I said, though the words felt hollow coming from my mouth. I wasn't just doing what needed to be done. I was giving everything I had to this family, to Marco, to Dante. I had never thought I would find myself in this position, caught between duty and something else entirely. Dante didn't say anything else. He simply nodded, his eyes lingering on mine for a long moment before he turned and walked toward the door. But before he left, he paused. "Clara," he said quietly, his back to me. I looked up, startled by the way he said my name. "Thank you. For everything." His words hung in the air long after he left. I wasn't sure how to respond, but I knew one thing for sure. Everything was changing. And whether I was ready or not, the path ahead was one that would forever tie me to this family, to Marco, and to Dante. I woke up the next morning feeling a strange heaviness in my chest. The house felt different somehow, quieter than usual, like the calm before a storm. Dante's words from the night before lingered in my mind. "You've made him believe again." I didn't know what to make of it. What had started as a simple promise to Marco had turned into something far more complicated. I had given everything to help him, but in doing so, I was starting to lose sight of myself. I couldn't let that happen. Not now. Marco needed me more than ever. He was improving, slowly but surely, and I couldn't afford to lose focus. But the tension between Dante and me was becoming harder to ignore. It was subtle, yet palpable. The way he watched me, the way he spoke to me, it was different now, and I didn't know how to handle it. I couldn't afford to get distracted. Not when Marco was making such progress. The next morning, after breakfast, I found myself in the garden again, as if I was being drawn there by some invisible force. I needed space to think, to process everything that had been happening. Marco's recovery was important, but so was the path that Dante and I seemed to be heading down. I didn't know where it was leading, but I had a sinking feeling that the closer we got, the more difficult it would be to break away. I sat on the stone bench, staring at the flowers, trying to clear my mind. But my thoughts kept drifting back to Dante, to his words, to his gaze. I couldn't get them out of my head. I heard footsteps approaching, and before I could react, I saw Dante standing in front of me. He was looking at me with that same intensity, his eyes fixed on mine in a way that made my heart race. "Clara," he said, his voice low but warm. "We need to talk." I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. "What about?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Dante hesitated for a moment, his gaze never leaving mine. "About you," he said simply. "About us." My breath caught in my throat. I had known this moment was coming, but I wasn't ready for it. I had spent so much time focusing on Marco's recovery that I hadn't given any thought to what was happening between Dante and me. I had convinced myself that it didn't matter, that it was just a passing connection. But now here we were, and I knew, deep down, that it was far more than that. "Dante," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "I don't know what you want from me." He stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. "I want you to be honest with me, Clara," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I want you to stop pretending like you don't feel what I feel." I looked up at him, my heart racing. I had no idea what to say. The truth was, I did feel something for him. Something that scared me, something that I didn't know how to deal with. But I couldn't let myself give in to it. Not when Marco's future was at stake. "I can't," I said, my voice shaking. "I can't let myself feel that way. Marco needs me. He's the only thing I can focus on right now." Dante's expression softened, and for a moment, I saw something in his eyes that I hadn't expected. Understanding. "I know," he said quietly. "But don't you think you deserve something more, Clara? Don't you think you deserve more than just being a caretaker, more than just being in the background?" I shook my head, my thoughts in turmoil. "I don't know," I said honestly. "I never thought I'd be here, in this position, in this family. But Marco is everything to me, and that's all that matters right now." Dante took another step closer, his hand reaching out as if he were about to touch me. But he stopped, his fingers hovering just inches from my skin. "You don't have to choose between us, Clara," he said, his voice low, almost pleading. "You don't have to be just Marco's caretaker. You can be more. You can be a part of this family. You can be a part of my life." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. And for the first time, I realized that Dante wasn't just offering me a place in his world. He was offering me something I hadn't expected, something that scared me more than anything. A future that wasn't just about surviving, about caring for others. A future where I could finally live for myself. I looked at him, my heart pounding in my chest. "I don't know if I can," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "I don't know if I'm ready for that." Dante stepped back slightly, his eyes searching mine. You don't have to be ready, he said quietly. But I want you to know that the offer is there. I want you to know that you matter. To me. To Marco. To all of us. I didn't know what to say. His words were like a balm to the wounds I hadn't even realized I had. I had spent so much time pushing everything down, pretending that I could handle it all. But now, Dante was offering me something I hadn't allowed myself to imagine. A chance at something more. But could I take it? Could I let go of the walls I had built around myself? Could I truly allow myself to believe that I could be more than just Marco's nanny? Dante's presence was like a force. I couldn't escape, and part of me didn't want to. But there was another part of me that was terrified of what that meant. What it would mean for Marco, for my place in this family, for my future. I stood there, frozen, unsure of what to say. But Dante didn't push me. He just stood there, waiting, as if giving me the space to figure it out. And for the first time, I felt like I had a choice. A choice to step forward or stay in the shadows. A choice to embrace what was happening between us, or to walk away from it. The decision was mine. But I wasn't ready to make it yet. Not today. I woke up the next morning with a heavy heart, the weight of Dante's words from the night before still lingering in my mind. You matter. To me. To Marco. To all of us. Those words echoed in my thoughts, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between us. But what did that mean? What did it mean for me, for Marco, and for this complicated relationship that had started to unfold? I had promised myself that I would focus on Marco's recovery, and nothing else. But every time Dante spoke to me, every time he looked at me with those eyes that seemed to see right through me, I couldn't ignore the pull. I couldn't deny the way my heart responded, the way his words made me feel like maybe, just maybe, I was more than just a caretaker. The day went on like any other, with therapy sessions, meals, and the steady routine I had come to depend on. But in the back of my mind, I couldn't stop thinking about Dante, about what he had said, about what he was offering me, and I realized that I had come to a crossroads. I couldn't keep ignoring what was happening between us. I couldn't pretend that I didn't feel something for him, something deep and complicated, something that scared me more than I wanted to admit. As the day wore on, I found myself alone in the garden again, the quiet of the evening settling over me. The air was cool, the sky painted in soft shades of pink and orange as the sun began to set. I was trying to clear my mind, to find some clarity, but the more I tried, the more my thoughts kept circling back to Dante. I heard footsteps approaching, and before I could react, Dante was there, standing just a few feet away from me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. We just stood there, in the silence, the tension between us palpable. "Clara," he said, his voice soft but firm, like he was about to say something important. I looked at him, my heart racing, but I didn't know what to say. "I've been thinking a lot," Dante continued, his eyes never leaving mine. "About what we talked about. About you and me." My breath caught in my throat. I knew this conversation was coming, but I hadn't expected it to be so soon. I had been avoiding it, trying to push it out of my mind, but now it was here, and there was no escaping it. "Dante," I said, my voice barely a whisper, "I don't know what to say." He took a step closer, his presence overwhelming in a way that made everything else fade into the background. "You don't have to say anything," he replied, his voice steady, but with an undercurrent of something I couldn't quite place. "I just need you to know that I'm not just offering you a place in this family because of Marco. I'm offering it because I want you here, because I've come to care about you." His words hit me like a wave, crashing over me, and for a moment, I couldn't speak. I had spent so much time convincing myself that I couldn't allow myself to feel anything for him, that I couldn't let myself get caught up in whatever was happening between us. But standing there, in front of him, hearing him say those words, I couldn't deny it anymore. I cared about him. More than I should. More than was safe. "Dante, I began, but I couldn't finish the sentence. I didn't know how to put my feelings into words. It was too complicated, too overwhelming. Dante reached out then, his hand gently brushing against mine. It was a small touch, but it sent a shock through me, a feeling that was both thrilling and terrifying. "I know it's not easy," he said, his voice softer now, almost vulnerable. "But I'm willing to make it work if you are." I felt a lump form in my throat as I stared at him. This wasn't just about me and him. This was about everything, about the life we had built, the life we could build together. And yet, there was still so much uncertainty. I don't know if I can, I said, my voice shaky. I don't know if I can let myself be a part of this. Dante stepped closer, his expression softening. You don't have to decide right now, he said, his voice calm. But just know that I'm here. And I'm not going anywhere. I felt a warmth spread through me at his words, but it was mixed with fear. Fear of what this could mean, of what it would cost me. I had come here to take care of Marco, to help him heal, and now I was caught in something I didn't fully understand. But in that moment, standing in the garden with Dante, I realized something. I couldn't keep running from it. I couldn't keep pretending like I didn't feel what I felt. Dante had opened the door to something new, something I wasn't ready for but couldn't deny. And for the first time, I realized that maybe I wasn't the only one who needed to heal. Maybe, just maybe, Dante did too. And for whatever reason, we were both here, in this moment, at this crossroads, together. I looked at him, my heart pounding in my chest. I don't know where this is going, Dante, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. But I'm willing to find out. Dante's eyes softened, and for the first time, I saw the man behind the Mafia boss. The man who had been hurt, who had built walls around himself. The man who had let me in, despite everything. Then let's figure it out, he said quietly, his hand still resting gently on mine. And in that moment, I felt like we were on the edge of something new. Something uncertain, something dangerous, but something worth the risk. I stood there in the quiet of the garden, my heart pounding, as Dante's words echoed in my mind. Let's figure it out. It was the first time I had truly felt the weight of everything that had been happening. The pull between us, the connection that had started out so innocently with Marco's recovery, was now something more. Something I hadn't planned for. Something I wasn't sure I was ready for. But as I looked into Dante's eyes, I knew that I couldn't turn away. Not anymore. We will, I finally said, my voice steady. Dante smiled slightly, but there was a depth to it that made my heart skip a beat. He didn't say anything else, just took my hand in his, and we stood there in the fading light, the weight of our unspoken words hanging between us. The next few weeks passed in a blur. Marco's progress continued steadily, each day bringing a new victory, no matter how small. But it wasn't just Marco who was changing. Something was shifting in me, in Dante, in the way we interacted. We weren't just the Mafia boss and his nanny anymore. We were something else. The walls between us were starting to break down. It wasn't easy. It wasn't always clear. But there was a quiet understanding between us now, something that had been absent before. Marco was still the center of everything. But now, there was room for something else to grow. There were moments, late at night when the house was quiet, when Dante would come to me, and we would talk about everything and nothing. The small things, the big things. What he wanted for Marco, what he wanted for himself, and what we both wanted for the future. Those conversations were like a lifeline. A way to understand each other. A way to move past the roles we had played for so long. What do you want, Clara? Dante had asked one evening, his voice low, his eyes searching mine. It was the question that had been on my mind for so long. I want to help Marco, I had replied, without hesitation. I want him to walk again, to be free. I want him to have a future. Dante nodded, his eyes never leaving mine. And after that, he asked, what do you want for yourself? I had paused, unsure of how to answer. I had spent so much of my life caring for others, putting everyone else first, that I had forgotten what it felt like to think about myself. But standing there, with Dante watching me, I realized that it was time to make that choice. I don't know, I said honestly. I've spent so much time focused on taking care of others, that I don't even know what I want anymore. But I want to figure it out. I want to live my life, not just exist. Dante's gaze softened, and he stepped closer. You deserve that, he said quietly. You deserve more than you've been given, more than I've given you. I could feel the weight of his words, the sincerity behind them. For the first time, I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, I could have more. I wasn't just a caretaker, a servant in this grand house. I was a person with my own desires, my own future, and I was ready to claim it. The next day, as Marco and I finished another round of therapy, I felt a sense of pride that was unlike any I had felt before. Marco had come so far, and I had been there every step of the way. But now, I was ready to take the next step in my own life. Dante had shown me that I didn't have to remain in the background. I didn't have to settle for a life I hadn't chosen. I could be part of this family, part of something bigger, if that was what I wanted. The decision wasn't easy. There were still many things that were uncertain. But for the first time in my life, I felt like I had a choice. I wasn't just the nanny. I wasn't just the person who took care of Marco. I was someone who mattered. Someone who could shape my own future. And as I looked at Dante, standing there across the room, I realized that I wasn't the only one who had changed. He had changed, too. And we were ready to face whatever came next, together. It wasn't going to be easy, and there would be challenges ahead. But we had a chance now, a chance to build something new, something real. And for the first time in a long time, I was ready to embrace it. Marco was still the center of my world, but now, there was room for more. Room for me, room for Dante, and room for all of us to create something that was ours. And that, in itself, felt like a victory. Experience the intense emotions and complexities of love in this gripping story that unfolds within the walls of a powerful family. Follow Clara, a devoted nanny, as she navigates the delicate relationship she forms with Marco, the young boy she's caring for, and the enigmatic Mafia boss, Dante. As Marco begins his journey toward recovery, Clara finds herself caught in a whirlwind of unexpected feelings, where duty and desire collide. The story weaves together the deep emotional connections that develop between the characters, making it one of the most captivating romance stories you'll ever read. As Clara grows closer to Dante, their connection becomes undeniable, filled with moments of vulnerability, tension, and passion. Will Clara be able to hold on to her promises to Marco and her sense of self? Or will the powerful bond with Dante lead her down a different path? Dive into this roller coaster of emotions and discover how two people from completely different worlds can find common ground in the most unexpected of places. Filled with heartwarming moments, this is a must-read for fans of romance stories. Every chapter brings you closer to the complex layers of love and redemption. Don't miss out on the journey of Clara and Dante. This is a story that shows how love can be a powerful force that changes everything. With every twist and turn, you'll find yourself immersed in this unforgettable narrative, where emotions run deep and love has the power to heal. Whether you are a fan of love stories or just looking for something that will tug at your heartstrings, these romance stories are guaranteed to leave you wanting more.